Have you ever had that unsettling feeling in the pit of your stomach when someone close to you says all the right things, yet something feels deeply wrong? Their words express affection, but their energy leaves you feeling drained. They smile, but their eyes remain cold. They're present in body, but somehow absent in spirit. You dismiss these feelings, telling yourself you're being paranoid. After all, this is someone you trust, someone who claims to care about you. But what if your intuition is trying to warn you of something your conscious mind refuses to see? But what if I told you that some of the people closest to you, people you consider friends, family, even lovers, secretly harbour feelings of hatred toward you? And what if I told you that they reveal this hatred not through direct confrontation, but through subtle psychological patterns that most people miss entirely? This isn't about becoming paranoid or mistrusting everyone around you. It's about understanding a fundamental psychological reality that Carl Jung, one of history's most profound psychological thinkers, uncovered through decades of clinical work, the reality of unconscious hatred and how it manifests in human relationships. Today's video is for those who sense something is wrong but can't quite name it, for those who feel gradually diminished in certain relationships but don't understand why, for those brave enough to look beyond social niceties to the psychological undercurrents that actually govern our connections with others. I'm going to reveal the 7 signs that Jung identified as indicators of unconscious hatred. Signs that are so subtle yet so devastating that most people never recognize them until irreparable damage has been done. And by the end, you'll possess a clarity about your relationships that will forever change how you navigate your social world. In this video, I'll explain the psychological concept of masked animosity that Jung discovered in his clinical practice, the 7 unconscious signs that reveal hidden hatred, and how to protect yourself when you identify these patterns. Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, spent much of his career exploring what he called the shadow, the part of our unconscious that contains all we deny about ourselves, including our capacity for hatred. What makes Jung's insight so powerful is his recognition that the shadow doesn't just disappear when we deny it. Instead, it manifests indirectly, often in our closest relationships. I've dedicated years to studying not just Jung's original writings, but also modern psychological research that validates his observations. I've documented hundreds of cases where these patterns played out exactly as Jung described, often with devastating consequences for those who failed to recognize them. One clarification before we begin: this video isn't suggesting that everyone in your life secretly hates you. Most relationships contain authentic care mixed with normal frustrations. What we're looking for are specific, consistent patterns that Jung identified as indicators of a darker psychological current. What's most disturbing about these signs is that they don't appear in your enemies or strangers. They appear in those who claim to love you, support you, and want the best for you. And that's what makes them so damaging. They create a cognitive dissonance that can make you doubt your own perception of reality. Now, let's dive into the first and perhaps most pervasive sign of secret hatred that Jung identified in his work with patients. Imagine planting a garden. Each day you nurture your plants, ensuring they receive proper sunlight and water, yet somehow they keep withering. Upon closer inspection, you discover that while you sleep, someone has been pouring small amounts of poison onto their roots, not enough to kill them immediately, but enough to ensure they never truly flourish. This is precisely what Jung observed in relationships harboring unconscious hatred, a pattern of subtle devaluation that slowly diminishes the target's sense of self-worth and capability. Jung called this shadow projection. When one person unconsciously projects the devalued aspects of themselves onto another, then responds to them as if those projections were real. This creates a psychological dynamic where the target is subtly diminished over time. The devaluation pattern manifests in several distinct ways. First, there's what modern psychologists call competitive caring. This occurs when someone appears supportive but always manages to remind you of your vulnerabilities or shortcomings in the process. They might say, "I'm so impressed you applied for that job. It takes courage to put yourself out there, especially given your history of rejection." The support is poisoned with a subtle reminder of your past failures. Second, there's what Jung termed minimization, the consistent downplaying of your achievements, concerns, or needs. When you share good news, the response is muted or quickly redirected. When you express a concern, it's dismissed as an overreaction. When you accomplish something meaningful, it's acknowledged briefly before the conversation moves elsewhere. Third, there's selective memory, consistently remembering your failures while forgetting your successes. The person might repeatedly bring up mistakes from your past while needing reminders of your achievements. Jung noted this pattern specifically as an indicator that the person is maintaining an internal narrative about you that requires evidence of your inadequacy to sustain itself. What makes the devaluation pattern so insidious is its plausible deniability. Each individual instance can be explained away as a misunderstanding, a bad mood, or your own sensitivity. It's only the pattern over time that reveals its true nature. But why would someone who ostensibly cares about you engage in this pattern? Jung's answer was both simple and profound. What we cannot accept in ourselves, we unconsciously attack in others. The person devaluing you is often wrestling with their own deep sense of inadequacy that they cannot consciously acknowledge. The most telling indicator of the devaluation pattern is how you feel in its presence. Jung noted that prolonged exposure to this dynamic creates a specific emotional signature, a vague sense of deflation after interactions, a growing reluctance to share achievements or vulnerabilities, and a pervasive feeling that you must make yourself smaller to maintain the relationship. Consider the friend who consistently tells you how much they value authenticity, yet treats you differently depending on who else is in the room. Or the partner who emphasizes the importance of trust while creating situations where trust becomes increasingly difficult. Or the family member who insists they want you to succeed, yet somehow creates obstacles when you attempt to do so. Jung identified this pattern as the contradiction complex, a situation where someone's expressed values and intentions are consistently contradicted by their actual behavior. And far from being simple hypocrisy, Jung saw this as a reliable indicator of unconscious conflicted feelings, often including hidden animosity. The contradiction complex manifests in three primary ways. First, there's the contradiction between stated values and actual treatment. The person espouses principles like loyalty, honesty, or support, but their behavior toward you violates these very principles. What makes this especially confusing is that they may genuinely uphold these values in other relationships, making their failure to do so with you all the more significant. Second, there's the contradiction between encouragement and enablement. The person verbally encourages your goals and growth, but behaves in ways that make those goals more difficult to achieve. They might offer to help with a project but consistently create delays. They might encourage you to pursue an opportunity, but fail to provide promised assistance, leaving you in a worse position than if they had never offered. Third, there's the contradiction between public and private treatment. The person presents one face when others are watching and another when you're alone. They may be supportive, even effusive in group settings, only to become critical or dismissive in private. Or conversely, they may seem supportive in private but subtly undermine you in public. What makes the contradiction complex so damaging is that it creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a state of holding two conflicting beliefs simultaneously. The target of this pattern is constantly trying to reconcile the person's expressed care with their contradictory actions, often blaming themselves in the process. If you find yourself repeatedly disoriented by the gap between someone's expressed intentions and their actual impact on your life, you may be experiencing what Jung identified as a significant sign of unconscious hostile feelings the person themselves might deny even to themselves. Imagine you're preparing for an important presentation. A close colleague offers to review your slides the night before. They suggest numerous changes that seem helpful, until you discover during your presentation that key information is now missing. Your flow is disrupted, and your most compelling points have been diluted. When you later mention this, they express surprise and concern, suggesting perhaps you were just nervous or underprepared. This scenario illustrates what Jung called subtle sabotage, a pattern where someone undermines your success or well-being while maintaining the appearance of support. Unlike explicit sabotage, which is obvious and easily identified, subtle sabotage operates beneath the radar, often leaving you questioning your own perceptions rather than the other person's intentions. Subtle sabotage manifests in several distinct patterns. First, there's helpful harm, offering assistance that actually creates additional problems. This might be giving advice that leads you astray, helping in ways that create dependency rather than empowerment, or providing support that comes with hidden costs. The defining feature is that the help reliably leaves you worse off, though this only becomes apparent over time. Second, there's induced doubt, consistently raising questions or concerns that undermine your confidence precisely when you need it most. Before important events or decisions, the person introduces doubts about your readiness, abilities, or choices. These doubts are framed as care. I just want to make sure you've considered everything. But their timing and content serve primarily to shake your confidence rather than enhance your preparation. Third, there's what Jung termed environmental interference, subtle alterations to your environment or circumstances that create obstacles. This might involve forgetting to deliver important messages, making changes to shared spaces that affect your functioning, or creating situations that drain your energy or resources before significant events in your life. What makes subtle sabotage so psychologically damaging is not just its practical impact, but the gaslighting effect it creates. Because the behaviours are disguised as support or occur outside your direct awareness, questioning them often leads to responses that make you doubt your own perceptions. I was only trying to help. You're reading too much into this. Or, it sounds like you're blaming me for your problems. The most reliable indicator of subtle sabotage is a pattern where your success or well-being mysteriously diminishes in direct proportion to a specific person's involvement in your life. Individual incidents may seem insignificant or easily explained away, but the cumulative pattern tells a different story. Notice how certain people in your life seem to create situations that provoke intense emotional reactions from you, reactions that they then use to confirm a narrative about you being too sensitive, unstable, or overreacting. These same people remain remarkably calm during conflicts they themselves initiated, positioning themselves as the rational party while you become increasingly emotional. Jung identified this pattern as the emotion extraction effect, a subtle psychological dynamic where one person unconsciously provokes emotional reactions in another, then uses those reactions to diminish them. Far from being random, Jung saw this as a sophisticated, though usually unconscious, strategy for expressing hostility while maintaining the appearance of reasonableness. The emotion extraction effect operates through several mechanisms. First, there's what modern psychologists call provocative ambiguity, making statements or taking actions that can be interpreted in multiple ways, with at least one interpretation being potentially offensive or hurtful. When you react to the negative interpretation, the person expresses surprise or confusion. "That's not what I meant at all. Why would you think that?" This creates a double bind. Either you accept their alternative explanation and doubt your own perception, or you persist in your interpretation and are labelled as someone who assumes the worst of others. Either way, you lose psychological ground. Second, there's emotional threshold testing, repeatedly crossing small boundaries to identify your emotional triggers, then using those precise triggers during moments when you need to be at your best. The person seems to have an uncanny knowledge of exactly what will destabilize you emotionally, and they deploy this knowledge at strategically harmful moments. Third, there's reaction exploitation, deliberately using your emotional reactions to paint a narrative about your character or stability. Your justified anger becomes proof of your volatility. Your tears become evidence of manipulation. Your frustration becomes confirmation of your immaturity. Over time, this creates a distorted mirror where your normal human emotions are reflected back as character flaws. The most reliable indicator of the emotion extraction effect is a persistent feeling that you cannot be your authentic emotional self around a specific person, that your natural responses are consistently used against you, leaving you feeling both provoked and punished for responding to the provocation. Think about the friend or family member who consistently brings a third person into your conflicts, someone who invariably takes their side, or those people who never address issues directly with you, instead discussing them with mutual connections who then approach you on their behalf, or someone close to you who subtly turns others against you through selective storytelling about your interactions. Jung identified this pattern as triangulation, a psychological maneuver where a person introduces third parties into what should be a direct relationship dynamic. Far from being a simple communication preference, Jung saw this as a significant indicator of unconscious hostile feelings. Triangulation operates through several specific mechanisms. First, there's what family systems psychologists call surrogate conflict, using a third party to express negative feelings or make demands that the person doesn't want to express directly. The third party becomes an emotional proxy, delivering the negative message while the original person maintains clean hands. I wasn't going to mention it, but Sarah thought you should know. Second, there's coalition building, systematically turning mutual connections against you by sharing carefully selected versions of conflicts or interactions. This isn't just venting frustrations to a friend, it's a strategic, though often unconscious, campaign to isolate you socially while strengthening the person's position through recruited allies. Third, there's comparative devaluation, consistently comparing you unfavourably to others in your social circle. This might involve frequent mentions of how another friend handles similar situations better, subtle comparisons that highlight your deficiencies, or creating implicit competitions where you're positioned to lose. The comparisons may seem casual or even complimentary toward the third party, but their cumulative effect is to diminish you. The most reliable indicator of triangulation is a persistent sense that your relationship with someone exists, more in the context of group dynamics than in direct interaction. That conflicts never reach resolution through direct communication, but instead spiral outward to involve an expanding circle of others. Some people in your life are consistently available when you're struggling, yet mysteriously absent when you're succeeding. Others show the opposite pattern, eagerly sharing in your achievements but disappearing when you face challenges. Many exhibit attention and engagement that fluctuates precisely with your emotional state, but always in a way that leaves you feeling worse. Jung identified this pattern as conditional presence, a situation where someone's emotional availability and engagement depends on your being in a specific psychological state. Unlike normal fluctuations in attention or energy, conditional presence follows a consistent pattern that reveals unconscious preferences about how they want you to be. Conditional presence manifests in several distinct ways. First, there's what contemporary psychologists call inverted support. Being emotionally present and supportive when you're in a one-down position, struggling, failing, uncertain, but becoming distant or disengaged when you're succeeding or confident. The support feels genuine in the moment, but mysteriously evaporates precisely when things are going well for you. Second, there's state-dependent engagement, being fully present only when you're in specific emotional states that serve the other person's psychological needs. This might mean they engage deeply when you're accommodating their preferences but become distant when you assert boundaries. Or they might be attentive when you're focusing on their concerns but distracted when you bring up your own. Third, there's crisis-only intimacy, a pattern where genuine emotional intimacy occurs only during periods of difficulty or drama. The relationship feels most alive and connected when navigating problems, but struggles to maintain authentic connection during normal, stable periods. The most reliable indicator of conditional presence is a persistent feeling that you must monitor and modulate your authentic self to maintain the connection, that certain states, achievements, or struggles must be hidden or highlighted to ensure the other person remains engaged. Ever left certain interactions feeling inexplicably deflated, even when nothing overtly negative occurred? Perhaps you've shared good news with someone, only to walk away feeling less excited than before, or observed how a specific person consistently redirects conversations away from your moments of joy or pride toward more neutral or negative topics. Jung identified this pattern as joy suppression, a subtle but persistent dampening of positive emotional states that occurs in the presence of specific individuals. Unlike overt criticism or devaluation, joy suppression operates through seemingly innocent conversational patterns that nevertheless reliably diminish positive feelings. Joy suppression manifests through several specific mechanisms. First, there's what contemporary psychologists call joy stealing, subtly taking ownership of your positive experiences or achievements. This might involve the person emphasizing their role in your success, redirecting credit to themselves or others, or recasting your accomplishment as part of a collective effort. While seemingly supportive, these responses effectively transfer the psychological ownership of your positive experience, diluting your connection to your own joy. Second, there's premature redirection, changing the subject precisely when you're expressing enthusiasm, pride, or pleasure. The redirection often happens so smoothly that you don't consciously register it, yet you find your positive emotional state is somehow dissipated by the end of the interaction. Third, there's negative reframing, immediately identifying potential problems, concerns, or downsides of your positive experience. This often comes disguised as helpfulness. I'm just making sure you've considered everything, or I don't want you to be disappointed if. While occasional caution may be warranted, The pattern occurs consistently enough to function as a reliable dampener of positive emotional states. The most reliable indicator of joy suppression is a persistent feeling that your positive emotional states cannot survive intact in the presence of a specific person, that no matter how happy, proud, or excited you are entering an interaction, you leave feeling somehow diminished. We've explored 7 signs that Jung identified as indicators of unconscious hatred: the devaluation pattern, the contradiction complex, subtle sabotage, emotion extraction, triangulation, conditional presence, and joy suppression. Each of these patterns reveals a different facet of how unconscious negative feelings can manifest in relationships, often without either person fully recognizing the dynamic at play. Understanding these patterns isn't about becoming paranoid or suspicious. It's about developing what Jung called psychological sight, the ability to perceive the emotional currents that shape our relationships rather than being blindly carried along by them. There's a profound freedom in this recognition. When you can identify these patterns, you no longer need to doubt your own perceptions or blame yourself for the consistent diminishment you experience in certain relationships. You can see these dynamics for what they are, expressions of the other person's unacknowledged psychological material, rather than reflections of your worth or capability. This understanding creates choices that weren't available before. You might choose to create more protective boundaries within the relationship. You might decide to directly address the patterns you've observed, or in some cases you might recognize that the relationship in its current form doesn't support your psychological well-being and choose to step back from it. What's most important is that these choices come from clarity rather than confusion, from conscious awareness rather than unconscious adaptation. As Jung himself said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." If this exploration has helped you recognize patterns in your own relationships, write "I choose clarity" in the comments. Let's see how many people are ready to bring unconscious dynamics into the light of awareness. And don't forget to watch the next video in this series, where I'll explore the shadow integration process, Jung's method for healing the psychological wounds left by these relationship patterns and reclaiming the authentic self that may have been suppressed within them.